Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're going to navigate the incredibly complex landscape of the human mind, and we're going to do it by focusing intensely on one of its most misunderstood conditions, bipolar and related disorders. We'll be using this specific condition as our primary lens to explore exactly what happens when our minds develop psychological problems, the biological factors behind abnormal behavior, and the profound mechanics of mood disruption.
So, let's jump right in. How do we actually draw the line between normal, everyday mood swings and a true psychological disorder like bipolar? It's a question that's literally intrigued cultures for centuries. Human emotion is just so incredibly diverse, right? So finding that boundary between, just having a really good day and experiencing a clinical manic episode, well, it requires a very careful, structured look.
Here is our roadmap for today. We'll start with defining abnormal behavior, look at the history of psychological disorders, dive into modern classification and genetics, touch on anxiety and somatic symptoms, really dig into depressive and bipolar disorders, and finish up with schizophrenia spectrum disorders.
Section 1. Defining abnormal behavior. Let's get into it.
Okay, so we can actually break abnormality down into the 4 Ds, which gives us a really clear, universal starting point for understanding conditions like bipolar disorder. First up is deviance. Think of the unusually extreme euphoria, racing thoughts, or impulsivity you'd see in a manic episode. Second is distress. Basically, is this extreme emotional whiplash upsetting to the person experiencing it, or maybe to their family? Third, we have dysfunction, meaning it interferes with daily life, like when those depressive lows make simply getting out of bed feel completely impossible. And finally, danger. Does a manic state lead to reckless, financially, or physically harmful behavior? Looking through the lens of these 4 Ds helps us objectively evaluate just how severe those mood swings really are.
Now, we do have to weigh 2 distinct approaches here. Simply breaking societal rules versus behavior that is genuinely maladaptive. This is super fascinating when we look at the early stages of bipolar mania, which is known as hypomania. High energy, supreme confidence, needing way less sleep. Honestly, that kind of stuff might actually be praised in competitive, fast-paced corporate cultures. Society might really value that aggressive productivity. But does it foster the long-term well-being of the individual? If that hypomanic behavior inevitably leads to a massive crash, total burnout, or severely interferes with their growth, then it's maladaptive, regardless of how well it temporarily fits what society expects.
The famous analytical psychologist Carl Jung reminds us that our struggles, our shadows, are actually part of our wholeness. When we look at the crushing, shadow-like depths of the depressive states in bipolar disorder, it's absolutely crucial to realize this is a profound failure in adaptation, not something to be feared or stigmatized. Psychological disorders are fundamentally failures to adapt to life's changing environments, representing the very real and often very painful extremes of the human experience.
Moving right along to Section 2, the history of psychological disorders.
The way we treat psychological disorders is directly tied to how we understand their causes. And the perception of what we now call bipolar disorder, which historically was termed manic depression, has radically shifted over time. Ancient theories completely relied on supernatural forces, but the ancient Greeks, like Hippocrates, actually took an early biological approach. They might have blamed manic episodes on an excess of yellow bile, while attributing those deep, crushing lows of depression to too much black bile. Wild, right? After a dark return to superstition in the Middle Ages, the Renaissance and the Age of Reason thankfully brought the scientific method back to the forefront, paving the way for the clinical understanding of mood cycles that we have today.
Section 3. Modern classification and genetics. Let's look at how we categorize things today.
Clinicians today rely on 2 primary manuals with discrete, specific criteria to diagnose disorders. We have the DSM-5, which is used heavily in the United States, and the ICD-10, prepared by the World Health Organization. These manuals are huge. They ensure that when a psychiatrist diagnoses bipolar I disorder in one part of the world, they are measuring the exact same criteria for mania and depression as a doctor anywhere else on the planet, establishing a vital, unified global language.
Modern science utilizes the biopsychosocial approach, and this is absolutely critical for understanding bipolar disorder. Biology, psychology, and social environments all deeply intertwine here. Bipolar disorder actually has one of the strongest genetic, biological links of all psychiatric conditions. The heritability is remarkably high, meaning that biological vulnerability is often passed down through family trees. But genetics alone don't write the whole story. The psycho and social elements act as the triggers. A person might carry the biological markers for bipolar, but it often takes a significant psychological stressor or a massive social disruption, think a major life change, profound grief, or even severely disrupted sleep routines across time zones, to actively trigger the onset of a full manic or depressive episode. It's this perfect storm, the convergence of inherited, biological vulnerabilities, psychological coping patterns, and intense social stressors that ultimately determines how and when this complex mood disorder expresses itself. Understanding this interplay completely transforms our approach to treatment. It proves we can't just look at brain chemistry in a vacuum, and we can't just look at environmental stress without acknowledging that powerful genetic undercurrent.
Section 4. Anxiety and somatic symptoms.
While our deep focus today is on mood disruptions, it's really vital to briefly contrast them with anxiety disorders just to see how wildly different psychological mechanisms can operate. Unlike the massive overarching mood swings of bipolar disorder, conditions like generalized anxiety or obsessive-compulsive disorder are characterized by localized, overwhelming fear or specific behavioral loops. In OCD, obsessions are driven by an inability to stop thinking about a distressing idea, which leads to compulsions, those repetitive behaviors done just to alleviate that very specific anxiety. It's a targeted loop of fear and reaction, which is very different from a systemic mood shift.
We see another really stark contrast in somatic symptom disorders. Here, intense psychological difficulty actually manifests as real physical conditions, like sudden blindness or paralysis without any medical cause. It's literally a conversion of psychological distress into a localized bodily symptom. Contrast this with bipolar disorder, where the physical manifestations are systemic and profoundly biological in origin, like the literal biological inability to feel fatigue during a manic episode, even if you've been awake for days.
Section 5. Depressive and bipolar disorders.
Now we reach the very core of our exploration. To truly grasp bipolar disorder, we first have to deeply understand major depressive disorder, which forms the agonizing baseline or the low pole of the bipolar equation. This is not just a normal reaction to a bad day or a typical phase of sadness. Major depressive disorder is a sustained, suffocating period where a person completely loses interest in life. It involves a massive neurotransmitter drop that fundamentally alters physical and mental functioning. The physical exhaustion is just profound. The body feels incredibly heavy, sleep architecture is totally shattered, and basic cognitive tasks become monumental hurdles. Psychologically, it brings an inability to think clearly, excessive guilt, and feelings of absolute worthlessness. When we look at bipolar disorder, this crushing depressive state is half of the devastating cycle these individuals are forced to navigate.
And here is the absolute crux of bipolar 1 disorder, the devastating whiplash contrast between those deep, persistent negative moods and the alternating cycles of manic highs. While major depressive disorder keeps a person anchored in the dark, bipolar 1 disorder radically swings the pendulum to the absolute opposite extreme. An individual experiencing a manic episode will undergo a dangerous euphoric high that completely hijacks their brain chemistry. They experience grandiosity, believing they have immense power, immense talent, or global importance. Their thoughts race at an uncontrollable speed, making their speech rapid, pressured, and incredibly difficult to follow. Biologically, their need for sleep practically vanishes. They might sleep 2 hours a night for a week and feel absolutely buzzing with boundless energy. But this energy is incredibly destructive. Mania strips away impulse control and risk assessment, frequently leading to disastrous financial decisions, hypersexuality, or reckless behavior. They are functionally operating a high-speed vehicle with the brakes completely cut. And eventually, the brain simply cannot sustain this hyper-aroused state. The pendulum inevitably swings back, plunging the person straight down into the severe depths of major depression we just discussed. This relentless whiplash between feeling like an invincible god and feeling completely worthless takes a catastrophic toll on a person's physical health, their career, and their family. Because it's so biologically rooted, it requires careful, specialized medical management, often utilizing mood-stabilizing medications to literally put a ceiling on the mania and a floor on the depression, giving the individual a fighting chance to find equilibrium in the middle.
Section 6. Schizophrenia spectrum disorders.
It's crucial to briefly understand schizophrenia, primarily as a differential diagnosis to bipolar disorder. Schizophrenia essentially deteriorates an individual's thought processes and perceptions, categorized by positive symptoms like hallucinations and negative symptoms like a flat, emotionless affect. The reason this overlap matters so much is that severe bipolar mania can sometimes escalate to include psychotic features, like vivid delusions of grandeur. However, unlike the intense, cyclical mood swings of bipolar disorder, schizophrenia fundamentally and persistently strips away motivation and emotional expression over time.
Whether it's the intense genetic components we explored or the profound, exhausting whiplash of those manic depressive cycles, these are very real biological illnesses. Psychological disorders are a failure in adaptation. They are not a weakness of character. They absolutely must be viewed free from superstition, ignorance, and fear, deserving the exact same compassion and rigorous medical attention as any physical ailment.
I want to leave you with this final thought. How will you use this understanding to change the way our society views psychological well-being? Now that you understand the true mechanics of these conditions, what can you do today to help dismantle the stigma in your own community? Think about how you might support someone battling the intense, invisible mood fluctuations of bipolar disorder. Knowledge is our absolute best tool for empathy. Thank you so much for joining me on this deep dive into the mind. Keep learning, keep questioning, and I will see you in the next explainer.